to Together Women Rise's book club event. I'm Barbara Humphreys. I'm a volunteer on Rise's book club committee and a chapter member in Leland, North Carolina. I will be your moderator this evening, along with Wesley Howell, another volunteer on our book club committee. We're very pleased to have all of you here today for what I know will be a fascinating discussion of the book Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga. Before we get started, we have a lot of people joining us today, so here are a few Zoom instructions that will make sure everyone enjoys today's program. Please stay muted at all times during our presentation. Use the chat feature to enter where you're from. This feature is also where we'll share links, questions, and discussion items. Closed captioning has been enabled for this meeting, so please turn this on if you like in your Zoom toolbar. In attendance tonight, we have members, guests, and others who may be completely new to Together Women Rise. Please know that you are all welcome. Together Women Rise is a powerful community of women and allies and has been dedicated to achieving global gender equality for the past 20 years. We have hundreds of local chapters across the U.S. where members learn about gender equality issues, give grants to organizations that empower women and girls in low-income countries, and build community to forge meaningful connections with each other and with women and girls around the world. Our book club is another way to engage in our mission, to learn about global gender equality issues, and to experience community with others who care about making the world a better place for women and girls. For more information on our book club and how to get involved with Together Women Rise, please visit our website at togetherwomenrise.org. I'm now going to turn this over to Wesley Howell for our special conversation with our guest speaker today. Wesley is going to lead this conversation, and then our guest speaker will answer a few of your questions. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. Following this conversation, we will have our small breakout groups. We encourage you to stay for those breakout groups as they're a great chance to meet other members of the Rise community and to discuss our featured book. And finally, we'll wrap up and have our book giveaway at the end. So without further ado, I turn it over to Wesley to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara. We are so pleased and excited to have Dr. Beyene as our guest speaker tonight. And I want to recognize that she has asked us to call her Tina, but when I looked at her scholarship, I kind of went, oh my gosh, I don't know. I'm gonna keep reverting back to doctor. Tina is an assistant professor of gender and women's studies at California State University, Northridge. She is an interdisciplinary scholar. Her interests are gender-based violence and conflict zones, postcolonial, decolonial, and transnational feminisms, and critical development studies. Specifically, she examines the colonial underpinnings of the mass rape in African conflict zones, especially the 1994 Rwandan genocide. She's currently researching the politics of grassroots African feminism, grassroots African feminist organizing and political backlash with a focus on Ethiopia. Tina has also a background in applied research, especially on the topic of gender and STEM, which is dear to my heart. Prior to her academic career, she was an editor-publisher at the feminist publishing collective South End Press. So welcome, Tina. Oh, there we go.
I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi. So Nervous Conditions is considered a modern classic in the African literary canon, and it was voted one of Africa's top books of the 20th century. The BBC has described it as one of the 100 books that, quote, shaped the world, unquote. So before we even get started, about the content of the book, can you talk about why the book has such an impact and why it's considered so important?
Sure. And first, let me just say thank you for inviting me to join you in this book, which I love so much and I teach all the time. But I'll talk a little bit more about why I teach it. So this is a book that really brought to light the centrality of gender and sexuality to the colonial experience. And in doing so, it helped push these frameworks that viewed colonialism primarily as an economic system, which is sort of how Marxists had thought about it, or as a political and military system. And in this book, this book is really sort of an important feminist intervention in the anti-colonial literary canon, and which had tended to focus on men, whether they were revolutionaries or political prisoners or dictators and so on. And the book really brought attention to the psychic and embodied life of colonialism through a gendered lens. So in that sense, it really was one of those groundbreaking books that pushed beyond the existing paradigms for understanding colonialism. And it does a lot of other things, and I can get into that when we talk about the themes, but that's really one of the reasons why it's been so impactful. It just changed the subject of the colonial subject from the embattled Native man to the invisible Native woman. That's its importance, in my opinion, anyways.
And that, I think, is a great transition into talking about the author herself.
Okay.
Tsitsi, gosh, I practiced Dangarembga. Can you say it for us, please, correctly?
I barely know how to say this name. Dangarembga is as best as I got.
Thank you. I learned that she is not only a renowned author, but also a passionate human rights activist. And as a matter of fact, when we first chose this book back in 2022, she was found guilty and given a suspended sentence for inciting violence by staging a peaceful protest calling for political reform in Zimbabwe. So tell us a little bit more about her. And are there parts of it, I wondered myself, are there parts of this book that are sort of semi-autobiographical?
From what I gathered, it is a little bit semi-autobiographical, except of course it's very hard to ascertain how much of it is biographical, how much of it is metaphoric, or how much of it is just creative imagination. But she is a Zimbabwean novelist, but she was also trained as a doctor, a psychologist, actually, in Cambridge in the UK. But she's also written novels and playwrights, and she's made films and so on. So she's sort of like a creative and a science person. And it really isn't surprising that she would come to look at the psyche, the colonialism as a psychic phenomenon, because she is trained as a psychologist, as a psychiatrist, psychologist. She has a medical background. So the fact that she centers the body, it seems to make sense. From just sort of the biographical sketch that I've done of her when I teach this book, other things also seem to be resonant with some of the characters. For instance, it is said that her mother was one of the first Black women to hold a bachelor's degree in Rhodesia, which is currently Zimbabwe. So in that sense, she does seem to reflect that in the character of my guru, who's Baba Makuru's wife. Her father was a schoolmaster, so again, it might not be a stretch. This seems like a familiar setting. She also seemed to have lived in the UK as a child, which then kind of reminiscent of Nyasha's character. So because she lived in the UK and she studies in predominantly white schools, there seems to be that kind of experiential point of reference as well. And she also herself was sort of a pioneer in being the first Black woman from Zimbabwe to have had a book published in English. And so there's a lot of things that resonate to me as I read, and of course, Nervous Condition is the first of a trilogy, and it follows the character of Tambu. And then the second book is the Book of Nod, and the last one is this mournable body, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which had even just as much acclaim, but more on that later. So I think there is a lot of a lot of a demonstration of the feminist tenet that the personal is political in this book.
And that's sort of then you teach this book as a text in a feminist theory class, right? And so how does this book fit in with then what you teach in feminist theory? It's kind of a big question, but yeah.
Okay, so I'm a postcolonial feminist scholar, which means that I approach the question of modern gender relations within a historical lens. And if we really look at gender relations around the globe in the last 500 years, we really have to look at three fundamental events that are inexplicably tied up with the experiences of gender around the globe. One is the rise of capitalism. The other one is the transatlantic slave trade and the dawn of European colonialism, which by 1930 controlled about 84% of the globe. So any experience of women around the globe within the last 500 years, including the modern era, cannot really be separated outside of these dynamics. And consequently, we live with the legacy of this economic, political, and cultural ramifications of these intertwined events. And so for me, it's really, in feminist theory, one of the questions that we ask is what we call the women question. What is woman? How do you define woman? And it's really impossible to answer that question or explore. You can't answer it, but you can explore it. And gender relations without unpacking some of the effects of these pivotal developments. And because postcolonial theory can be a little dense or complex, I usually try to pair the theories with a novel that illustrates some of these key themes of gender and race and class and colonialism. And of course, nervous condition is the perfect embodiment of these ideas. So that's one of the appeals of this book for me in the classroom. Um, and it really allows me to think about these dynamics of gender, race, and colonialism, and through the lens of the 1960s British settler colonial Rhodesia.
Mhm.
And it allows me to really raise what it does is it allows me to rework some of the core theorists of colonialism, like Frantz Fanon, who was a Martinique writer, who had a lot of insight on colonialism as a pathological system that traumatized the colonized subject. And so what Dangarembga does is offer a feminist interpretation of these theories. She pushes beyond Fanon. So who Fanon famously, after his really brilliant analysis at the end, he says, of the woman of color, he says, I know nothing about her. So in a way, this book is a response to this kind of erasure of the female subject. So that's one of the reasons that I use it. And it really does kind of bring to life through these characters all the core theories of postcolonial theory.
And what are some of, as we actually get into the text itself then, or into the text itself, yeah. What are some of the themes of gender equality that we're seeing in the text?
Okay, well, before I answer that question, I don't know if it's helpful to just give a little bit of a background of Zimbabwe and how the
Yes, yes,
okay.
that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you. Yeah.
So, just historically, Zimbabwe is an old civilization, and beyond that, it has a history that's really, really old. But just in the pre-colonial Zimbabwe, from the 15th century on, it was a huge empire, in fact. Um, and trade went as far away as China and India and the Middle East and Near East and East Africa and so on. So there was a lot of interregional areas that it was tied up in. The Portuguese arrived in the 15th century with the fantasy of opening up the continent from the interior all the way to their eastern settlements in Angola. So they wanted to go from east to west, and the slave trade was also very active in that route. And from 1880s to 1965, the British had taken over that territory. So what is now modern Zimbabwe was Rhodesia, and it was a British rule. And from 1965 to 1980, which is when the country gained independence, it was actually a white minority settler colonial state. And it had a system of racial segregation, which is known as apartheid. It 1980s, the country gained independence after a very long civil war, and its independence was both from British and South Africa, and it was renamed Zimbabwe by its long lasting leader, Robert Mugabe. What's fascinating about it, to really situate this novel, is that in the 20th century, even after the colonial exit, the change of the system, Christian mission schools exercised influence in the country. And most of the members of the first cabinet of the independent Zimbabwe were actually graduates of these schools. I don't know if you know much about the history of colonialism in Africa, but these first leaders in the independence era were known in the French colonies as the évolués, or the evolved, because they were taught to take on the new and complex machinery of the colonial era. And it really, Baba Mukuru kind of embodies that character. The other interesting thing about Zimbabwe is that almost 4/5 of the country is Christian. So the Christian mission schools and Christianity and colonialism are like deeply intertwined in that novel, and hence a very important theme. Okay, so themes. There are a lot of ways to approach this novel. I'm not a literary person, so I don't think about it that way. I think about this book in terms of its relationship to colonial theories. Um, it is a book that is centered on colonial education and the quest for self-definition through the perspective of a village girl, really. And it also talks about, really, another big theme is the dilemma, women's dilemma within two systems of patriarchy. One that is traditional, that is native, and one that is modern colonial. And it's about how women get caught in these systems. The other really important theme for me in this book that I really emphasize in my classes is the making of colonial rule through non-coercive means. In other words, the role of consent in building colonial power. And that means how colonial institutions discipline and rule Native people through consensual institutions of consent, like religion and education, as opposed to military or prisons or police or things like that. And it really is about how we come to internalize systems of power through these institutions that make us have a personal relationship to these ideologies. Another theme that's really important is one of modern education as a patriarchal and colonial project, and how it shaped and reshaped masculinity and femininity of the Native population. So we see that a lot in the characters, how they shift in and out as they encounter these systems. It also the dilemma of the educated woman, what education made possible and what it foreclosed for Native women. And if you really can track it through the different characters, like in what ways are they facing a dilemma and a set of contradictions, and the ways in which the overlap of patriarchy, colonial education, and poverty also divide Native women, how the division in the society becomes more and more potent. Clearly, colonialism is also not seen as merely an economic phenomenon, but one that actually is very much acting on the body, and the female body particularly. It reminds me of that mantra, feminist mantra, your body is a battleground, that it is an embodied experience, and the female body is a site of damage and resistance in this novel in all kinds of interesting ways. And lastly, it's this question of agency, and especially Black girls as protagonists and agents in the anti-colonial resistance through their own bodies. So there are a lot of moments where it seems like they're being broken down by the experience interfacing with these institutions, and yet there's also a lot of refusal and resistance that's being enacted. So these are some of the things that I emphasize. I'm sure there's many more that others would draw out.
Sorry, I lost my unmute button there. Thank you. God, that's fascinating. And it also kind of brings us to our next question, which is just the fact that Nervous Conditions was first published in 1988. And so it's been, for those of us who can remember 1988, it's just like, oh my gosh, okay, 50 plus years since publication. Zimbabwe at the time was very newly liberated from being Rhodesia. And in today's Zimbabwe, much has changed. But what about women's experiences? What are some of the major things that have changed about the experience of women and girls in Zimbabwe? And then what are some of the things that have not changed about the experience of women and girls in Zimbabwe?
Okay, so this question actually picks up on the other question that you asked me about this wonderful body. So I will just say I'll kind of collapse those two questions together. Which is to say that the question is actually directly addressed by Dangarembga in her last book in the trilogy, This Mournable Body. This is precisely the question she takes on. What has changed? We meet Tambu in the 1960s at the dawn of independence. Not quite. It's still colonial Rhodesia, but it is sort of the coming of colonial education and the promise of education and women's liberation, and so on, the contradiction and the limits of it. So what happens in the 50 years? And she really traces the story in this trilogy. I didn't read the second book, to be honest, but I did read This Mournable Body, and it really was sort of, I can see the picture. This is so in that book, what we encounter is Tambu, who's now middle-aged. She's single, she's unemployed, and she is navigating the precarity of a neoliberal economic system and labor market. What that means is that the government is more focused on the quest for foreign investment and the provision of cheap labor for foreign investment. So it's the country has joined the rest of the world in the quest for cheap labor and industrialization and so on. And the state has become sort of paradoxical by this time. On the one hand, it espouses democracy, meaning voting. And also, we see a lot of discourses about women as agents of economic development and agents of anti-poverty and growth, while the state also primarily looks at the population and women as surplus labor. And it violates their human rights for the purposes of the provision of labor for these foreign investments and the foreign currency driven projects. So you have this really interesting paradox. And in a way, in this last book, Tambu is really the metaphor for what's happening in Africa, in my opinion, and which is urbanizing at this alarming rate that's keeping the continent indebted to the developed world. There's this mass urban impoverishment that's going on. The ruling class is increasingly corrupt, and that's become sort of a norm, a way of life. The rural population is dispossessed of its land for these development projects. So you have a lot of displacement. And women are also facing the paradox of investment by the state in their primary health care, like maternal care, maternal health, and primary education, but they're facing unemployment and, of course, no change in their care obligations whatsoever. And they're increasingly the faces of poverty and migration and basically precarious labor that roams the continent. So Tambu's no longer this kind of like critical, observant character. She is more of a desperate subject who's trying to internalize these neoliberal ideas of individual success. And I won't give away much more about what her journey looks like, but that's really the book does map what has changed in Zimbabwe in terms of women by consistently following this character through her life cycle.
Sorry, I'm just spacing my mute button here. Well, that was actually you sort of picked up our final question too, which was about the other books in the trilogy and how it sort of all comes together and what the major themes are. And you definitely made me want to read the other two books. That's I personally finished the book going, okay, what happens? What happened to Tambu? I love her. And so definitely I will now go back and finish the trilogy. I think Wendy has been taking a look at the questions in chat for us. Tina, is there anything else that you want to kind of say to put a little bow on it? Or you want to go to chat questions?
I think the only additional thing that I would say is that, you know,
Yeah.
for your organization that is concerned about global equality around the globe, I think that reading the book as a trilogy is really helpful because it really is not sort of, it doesn't paint a very rosy picture, but it does give you the shifting terrain of women's lives in the developed world. In the developing world, but also the things that remain constant. So it's not like we see the colonial impact going away. We just see a new intensification of capitalism. And through these characters, I think that you can get a little bit more beyond numbers and statistics and NGO-generated data. It really paints a visceral picture that I think is actually really important for anyone who's doing this work.
When did you want to read questions? You want me to? We do have a couple of questions, and if anyone has a question or something that they want to bring up, please put it in the chat.
So the first question that we have, Tina, is about Zimbabwe and its lack of legislation against female genital cutting. This wasn't mentioned in the book, but I wonder if you might comment on that.
I don't know. And I mean, I think that I can tell you a little bit from what I know in my own context. I'm Ethiopian, and that's a fairly widely practiced, but I don't know about Zimbabwe, but in Ethiopia, there are different approaches to this issue depending on the state that you're in. It's an ethnic federation. Different ethnicities practice it differently. All ethnicities practice it. All religions practice it. Christians practice it. Muslims practice it. Animists practice it. They practice it for health reasons, for gender purity reasons. They do it for sexual control reasons. The reasons are numerous, the practices are numerous, and so the interventions are also numerous. And I know that they may not be any concerted legislator in Zimbabwe, but I think there's been a lot of investment by the African states actually to tackle this. And if you look at the Ethiopian chart, you really do see the numbers coming down. And one of the things they did is really mobilize the women who were actually the traditional practitioners of cutting to become the educated and become sort of the they did the intervention on them. So those women are now the ones that are in charge of actually teaching the community about the effects of female genital circumcision and its impact and so on. So because they involve women, we're seeing the numbers going down, and they go down in some places a whole lot more than other places. But I think there's been a lot of intervention in African governments. I mean, I know that this is a topic that people in the West love to talk about a lot, but there's a lot of movement. So I suspect the same about Zimbabwe. I actually don't even know if they're really hardcore practitioners of circumcision in Zimbabwe, to be honest with you.
I think that the attendee may have just been commenting also on the fact that it's interesting that that wasn't included in the book, given, you know, there were sort of girls of that age that, you know, maybe would have been subjected to this.
Well, I just want to say that it's probably because it's not a common practice in Zimbabwe.
Thank you.
Yeah, it just isn't a commonly practiced all throughout Africa. There are places where it's practiced a little bit more than others, so I don't think it's relevant there.
In to your knowledge, was this one of the first books in Zimbabwe to feature a female character with an eating disorder?
I would imagine so. I can't tell you definitively, but I would imagine so. Not only in Zimbabwe, but I think just across the colonial literature, the post-colonial literature, I think it was the first time when the colonial experience and bulimia and eating disorders are actually, and mental health are actually linked, intertwined inexplicably.
What do you know about the situation for schooling for girls in Zimbabwe? And we're really testing your knowledge of the country, which I know is not your expertise per se, but you know, from what you know, is it common for there to be forced marriages? You know, how sort of progressive is Zimbabwe with women in the government?
Let me pass on that because I cannot verify any numbers for you. My guess is that, you know, they were British colony, and so they had a lot of these mission schools. So the rate of education overall in Zimbabwe historically was fairly high, actually, compared to other places. I don't know where they stand now because the currency has collapsed and they've had so many political and economic turbulence um, that I don't know how it stayed. But back in the day when I was growing up, I think Zimbabwe was one of the higher performers, just because of the schools. Like Kenya had high schooling, Zimbabwe has schooling, and so on. But again, these are really hard questions because if you're talking about rural areas versus urban areas, the experience is completely night and day too.
And I think we've certainly seen that with the grantees that we support, is that oftentimes they are sort of that last mile, extremely remote areas where things can be so much different. I love the comment in the chat about the mournable body, that someone else had read it in their book group and that they were blown away by the incredible writing. So hopefully everyone will add that to their list, and I put the titles of the two sequel books, so to speak, in the chat. I don't see any other questions right now, Wesley, so.
I think there was one question about the strength of the feminist movement. Lindy writes, I was in Zimbabwe in 1996 and overheard a discussion about women's rights and treatment in the workplace. It reminded me of conversations we had in the US in the 1970s. So I'm wondering about the strength of the feminist movement in Zimbabwe right now. I don't know if that's something that you're hooked into, Tina.
I mean, I can just tell you a little bit about just the Southern African landscape. They had a pretty powerful women's movement and feminist movement, and it came out of their struggle against apartheid. So the anti-colonial struggle and the anti-apartheid struggle was deeply intertwined with the feminist movement, and I should say Black feminist movement, actually, very clearly. Because part of their feminist issues were also connected to the racial politics of the area. So both in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, some of the most innovative and creative social movements, women's social movements, really have come out of women's participation, both for racial liberation and for gender liberation within these movements. So they're actually some of the most experienced people. As a matter of fact, when you get to this mournable body with the last trilogy, you'll meet the women who become actually very active revolutionaries and who also develop kind of a Black women's consciousness, a Black feminist consciousness, and you'll encounter it through the character of Lucia. she surfaces again. So again, she addresses this as well. But yeah, they have had a very very impactful and very powerful movement because of this experience of battling the colonial rule and apartheid specifically.
What a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much, Tina, Dr. Beyene. That has just been so interesting. And Wendy, I think you're going to take us to, I just really want to thank you for joining us. And Wendy, I think you're going to take us to the next portion of our program.
I'm going to pick that up.
Oh, there we go. Barbara, somebody is.
You knew someone was.
Someone is.
Yeah, well, I also want to thank Dr. Beyene so much for joining us tonight and sharing your insights on our featured book. And I also want to say that I think there are a number of people on this call who are ready to sign up for your class.
Well, come on in.
Yeah, it's very fascinating stuff. Thank you so much.